behold, they brought to him a man sick of the palsy, lying on a bed. And Jesus, seeing their faith, said unto the sick of the palsy, Son, be of good cheer, thy sins be forgiven thee. And behold, certain of the scribes said within themselves, This man blasphemeth. And Jesus, knowing their thoughts, said, Wherefore think ye evil in your hearts? For whether is easier to say, Thy sins be forgiven thee, or to say, Arise and walk? But that ye may know that the Son of Man hath power on earth to forgive sins. Then saith he to the sick of the palsy, Arise, take up thy bed, and go unto thine house. And he arose and departed to his house. But when the multitude saw it, they marveled and glorified God, which had given such power unto men. Matthew 9:3-8. One of the most common expressions to be heard among professed Christians when speaking of religious things is, I can understand and believe that God will forgive sin, but it is hard for me to believe that He can keep me from sin. Such a person has yet to learn what is meant by God's forgiveness. It is true that people who talk that way often have a measure of peace in believing that God has forgiven their sins, but through failure to grasp the power of forgiveness, they deprive themselves of such blessing that they might otherwise enjoy. So what is forgiveness? Forgiveness is a conscious, deliberate decision to release feelings of resentment or vengeance toward a person or group who has harmed you, regardless of whether they actually deserve your forgiveness. After you've been wronged and the initial wave of emotion has passed, you're presented with a new challenge. Do you forgive the person? By forgiving, you let go of your grievances and judgments and allow yourself to heal. While this may sound good in theory, in practice, forgiveness can sometimes feel impossible. To learn how to forgive, you must learn what forgiveness is not. Most of us hold at least some misconceptions about forgiveness. Forgiveness doesn't mean you're pardoning or excusing the other person's actions. It doesn't mean there's nothing further to work out in the relationship or that everything is okay now. Forgiveness doesn't mean you should forget the incident ever happened, and forgiveness isn't something you do for the other person. Instead, forgiveness means accepting the reality of what happened and finding a way to live in a state of resolution with it. This can be a gradual process, and it doesn't necessarily have to include the person you're forgiving. Forgiveness isn't something you do for the person you've wronged, it's something you do for you. So if forgiveness is something you do for yourself, and if it can't help you heal, why is it so hard? There are several reasons you're filled with thoughts of retribution or revenge. You enjoy feeling superior. You don't know how to resolve the situation. You're addicted to the adrenaline that anger provides. You self-identify as a victim. Or you're afraid that by forgiving, you have to reconnect or lose your connection with the other person. These reasons not to forgive can be resolved by becoming more familiar with yourself, with your thoughts and feelings, and with your boundaries and needs. Now that you know what forgiveness is not and why it's so hard to do, ask yourself the hard questions. Am I easily offended? Did this person mean to hurt me? Or do I want to forgive? Forgiveness requires feeling willing to forgive. Sometimes you won't because the hurt went too deep, or because the person was too abusive or expressed no regret. If you decide you are willing to forgive, find a good place and time to be alone with your thoughts. Think about the incident that angered you. Accept that it happened, and accept how you felt about it and how it made you react. In order to forgive, you need to acknowledge the reality of what occurred and how you were affected. Acknowledge the growth you experienced as a result of what happened. What did you learn from it about yourself? Perhaps you grew from it. Then think about the other person. He or she is flawed because all human beings are flawed. He or she acted from limited beliefs and a skewed frame of reference. When you were hurt, the other person may have been trying to have a need met from his skewed frame of reference. What do you think caused this need, and why did the person go about it in such a hurtful way? Finally, decide whether or not you want to tell the other person that you have forgiven him or her. If you decide not to express forgiveness directly, then do it on your own. Say the words, I forgive you, aloud, and then add as much explanation as you feel is merited. In Matthew 7:7 it says, Ask, and it will be given. Seek, and you will find. Knock, and the door will be opened to you. God can help us when we allow Him into our lives, hearts, and minds. It's through prayer that we are able to communicate to God and to build a relationship and reliance on Him, and He will give us the will to forgive. It's also important to pray for your offender. Matthew 5:44 says, "But I say unto you, love your enemies, bless them that curse you, do good to them that hate you, and pray for them which despitefully use you and persecute you." In the article Forgiveness and Reconciliation, this story was told. On February 12, 1993, Marlon Green attended a party in North Minneapolis, Minnesota. He was 16 years old. At the party, he got into a heated fight with 20-year-old Larry. Marlon was intoxicated, and neither person backed down in the fight. Marlon thought that Larry was reaching for a gun and pulled out his and shot him 3 times. He then shot him in the head, killing him. It was a brutal murder, another senseless case of urban violence. Larry's mother, Mary Johnson, was in shock for 3 months. In a Hennepin County courtroom, Mary Johnson had to be restrained after interacting with Marlon's mother, Carolyn Green. The argument became so heated, there was concern that Mary would strike Carolyn Green. She tried to forgive them, but didn't. Marlon Green was convicted of second-degree murder and sentenced to 25 years in prison. For Mary, she had nothing but contempt and pure hatred at Marlon and Carolyn Green. Mary looked at Marlon as nothing but an animal that needed to be caged. As Mary told the Minneapolis Star-Tribune in an article on December 23, 2010, "I was full of hatred. I saw him as an animal. I wanted him caged. I wanted him locked up for the rest of his life. That was justice for me." But the hatred was consuming Mary. She tried support groups which didn't help. She got justice, but she was torn apart internally. Mary eventually knew she had to forgive Marlon Green, so she did something incredibly brave when she asked to meet with Marlon Green in Minnesota's Stillwater State Prison. In prison, Marlon Green was struggling with the guilt of murdering someone. In an effort to make a new beginning, Marlon Green changed his name to Oshia Israel. At first, he turned down the request to meet with Mary Johnson. Oshia didn't want to be seen as vulnerable in a state prison. 9 months later, she made another request, which also had the Minnesota Department of Corrections leery as well. In preparation for the meeting, restorative justice workers held several preview meetings with both Israel and Johnson's to evaluate and gauge their motives. Johnson first met with female inmates from the Shakopee State Prison, and she saw herself in them. As Mary describes it, "That's when my heart began to change. I began to see them as people, not animals." The day Mary Johnson met with Oshia Israel was vivid. She even remembers the hand lotion that was given to her while she waited to see him. The lotion was called Beyond Belief, as it summed up her feelings at the time. In the room, Israel walked in, and Mary Johnson saw that he changed physically and mentally in the 12 years of being incarcerated. Mary Johnson started by saying that she didn't know him, and he didn't know her, and asked to get to know him better. Mary Johnson spoke about her son, and Israel spoke about his life. As the meeting came to a close, Mary Johnson told Oshia Israel, "I forgive you from the bottom of my heart," which led Israel to ask incredulously, "Ma'am, how can you do that?" Mary broke down and started crying and had trouble standing. Israel couldn't let her hit the floor and hugged her like Mary was his own mother. After security returned Israel back to the population, Mary Johnson said, "I just hugged the man who murdered my son." What happened next could only be described by Mary Johnson, who said, "All that stuff, all the junk deep inside me, I felt it rise from the bottom of my feet and leave me like nothing I've ever felt before. I had loosed him and let him go." The meeting was a resurrection and allowed Mary to be the person she used to be. Like in Mary's story, I hope you find that same blessing of being alleviated of a burden that so many of us carry.